Hey and welcome back to Fanfic Reading. Today we are reading The Warmth That Changed It All by Raalm and ToxicExotic. I hope you enjoy.
Chapter 37, A Sparsi Conversation. Yang Xiaolong. Thud. Thud. Smack. Thud. The sound of leather hitting leather and shaking chains echoed around the empty gymnasium in a way that would give most people a headache, but to Yang it sounded like music. Every thud of her gloved fist striking the hanging bag sang her praise, the sound telling of whether her punches were hitting their mark correctly. Rotating her shoulder as she lashed out with another jab, she heard the loud rattling of chains fill the room and tell her that the strike was a good one. Due to her not having spent any time on a bag in over a week, she felt the fatigue in her arms begin to build up a little more than it usually would have. It had been 40 minutes since she arrived at the gym, and while the room was still very cold due to the snow outside, and the heating not currently being on, Yang had already worked up enough of a sweat that the temperature didn't matter at all to her. Taking a short break, she wiped an arm along her forehead and let out a deep breath. Though she would prefer having a sparring partner, the heavy bag in front of her would have to make do, as the gym was yet to actually open. Thankfully, she was on a first-name basis with the owner, so the janitor was always willing to let her in early. However, that also meant her first opponent wouldn't arrive for at least an hour. Training had always helped clear her mind. The exercise and the eventual burning of her muscles was incredibly cathartic to her, and she relished every minute of it. It was a distraction she felt she needed a little more than usual. The day for her meeting with Raven was rushing closer faster than she thought it would. She was aware that less than 2 weeks was barely any time when they made the arrangement, but with only a couple of days left until their meeting, never had time seemed to act so weird. Occasionally time would slow to a crawl when she was doing things such as drawing or watching television, but seemed to speed up whenever she was just relaxing, the exact opposite of how time usually felt. Because of that, she had been trying to do as much as she could throughout the day in order to get just a little more time. Unfortunately, she was mostly alone in her attempts to put off the inevitable. While she normally would have talked to Blake or Weiss about her worries, both had been rather busy. Blake and Gyra had left for Menagerie the day after Christmas to visit a relative for a few days, and reception on the island was always rather spotty. That alongside the time difference made communication with her best friend exceptionally limited. As for Weiss, her girlfriend was extremely busy at the STC. Though they still kept in contact at night, it was clear that Weiss was trying to find time for them, and make sure she was okay. The sheer workload had left her with very little time to give. As usual, she was hesitant in turning to Ruby, as she liked to try and keep the strong face she had always shown intact. With the acceptance that there was no one that she could turn to at present, she let out a deep sigh and picked up her water bottle, taking a long swig to cool herself off. Feeling her throat thank her for the refresher, she tossed the drink back onto her bag and prepared to continue her exercise. However, as she threw out her first punch, she heard a loud cough behind her and turned to see why the janitor would interrupt her when he never had before, only to be met with a familiar pair of piercing blue eyes. "Your form is rather good," the older sibling said as she stepped out of the shadow of the doorway. She looked far less intimidating without her military jacket than when Yang had first met the woman, but there was still an undeniable strength in the way she carried herself. "Your hips could use a little more movement though." "Thanks," Yang replied slowly, the confidence built up by her sparring with the punching bag quickly fading as the blue eyes bored into hers, though they were noticeably softer than the last time they had met. "Should I be concerned that you seem to have followed me?" It was the only reason she could think of that Winter could possibly know where she was when she'd left the house before Ruby and her father had even awoke. "Have you done anything to cause such a worry?" Winter asked in a telling tone, the cold of her voice enough to make Yang question the answer. Fortunately, Winter removed her hands from her jacket and pulled open the zipper to begin removing it. "Relax, Miss Xiaolong. Should you have done something of concern, you would never have even known of my presence." The older woman peeled off what looked to be a rather thin thermal jacket and threw it over the ropes of the nearby boxing ring to reveal a white tank top beneath, the powerful-looking arms reaching out to grab the focus pads from the corner and quickly slipping them on. As she turned around and adjusted the gloves, Yang noticed a large, jagged scar that trailed down from the woman's shoulder and disappeared under the tank top, only to emerge from the bottom on her lower back. The mark was ghastly, the pink of the damaged tissue pink enough to stand out against the woman's pale skin, and from the consistency and raised nature of it Yang knew that whatever had caused it had not been an accident. However, Before she could contemplate what had caused such a mark, the stern woman turned around and smacked the pads to create a small cloud of dust. "Punching bags are never a good opponent," she said, and made her way over, holding up the paddles. "My sister says you are a proficient boxer, so show me what has impressed her so." Taking a second to comply, as she was still unsure why Winter was there, and highly doubted that she had followed her simply to spar with her, Yang watched the woman suspiciously until she received a raised eyebrow, the gesture clearly an impatient one. Figuring she would eventually find out what the reason was, Yang raised her fists and parted her legs, bending her knees to balance herself properly before throwing out her first punch. However, since she clearly had more weight on her than Winter did, and she didn't want to potentially injure her girlfriend's sister, she held back on the power a little and focused more on accuracy. The impact was a good one, her fist crashing into the middle of the cushioned pad and causing Winter's arm to jab backwards a little. Slightly emboldened at her first strike in front of Winter being a good one, she continued her actions and followed up quickly whenever Winter moved the pads. But with each hit, Winter's eyebrows furrowed a little more. After less than a minute, the woman dropped her arms to her side and gave Yang a glare that made her feel like her body had been dipped into a bath full of ice. "I may not have inherited my grandfather's brawn, but I am far from frail." The impatient tone matched her earlier look, and Yang reached back to scratch her head, though the glove somewhat hampering her nervous tick. "Sorry." "It's fine," she replied shortly, and raised her hands again. "Continue." Giving the woman a small nod, Yang returned to her stance again and continued, this time leaning into her strikes properly. True to her word, Winter barely flinched from the hits, her arms only jutting back slightly further than Nen did before. Glad to finally have a moving target, as the older she adjusted her arms for Yang to practice not only her jabs, but also her uppercuts and hooks, Yang quickly felt the exercise warm her body. "So?" Winter said, as she took a step back to simulate an opponent being on the back foot, Yang following but listening intently to the woman's words. "My sister has been a little worried about you of late." Not letting up as she knew Winter would likely scold her for doing so, Yang took a measured breath and eased up on the power a little so that she could concentrate on both the conversation and hitting her mark. "She asked you to check up on me?" "No," the woman replied as she moved the hand Yang was targeting aside and sidestepped, forcing Yang to preposition a little. "She has likely only just woken up. I have simply noticed her stress and, as her sister, felt I should try to ease it." "Oh," Yang sighed, and swung her right arm around for a hook. Though she knew Weiss considered Winter a great source of advice, Yang was a little hesitant due to the only time they had talked had essentially been a one-sided conversation that involved a death threat. "It's nothing really, just missing my friend, is all." "That's odd," Winter hummed after a well-placed jab and shook her arm. "And here I was under the assumption that you had yet to properly meet your mother, let alone know her enough to consider her as a friend you miss." Taken aback by the blunt statement of her sparring partner, Yang missed her strike and stumbled a little. As she stumbled, she felt the pad hit the back of her head. Looking up into the sharp blue eyes, she saw no remorse or care for having just said something so personal, and Yang's mind flashed back to when Weiss had first talked about her older sister. She had described Winter as harsh but well-meaning, and that showed clearer than ever as she stood there expectantly. The woman was blunt and clearly not going to accept a lie, but she was doing it for Weiss, so that her sister might stop worrying. It was exactly what Yang would do for Ruby. "She told you about that?" Yang sighed, waiting for Winter to put her hands up so that she could continue the punching. "Somewhat," the snow-haired woman replied, flicking her head slightly to get her fringe out of her eye. "She was rather vague, but when I looked into your record, I also looked into your parents and discovered that your birth mother had recently moved back into town. The link wasn't a difficult one to see." "Fair enough." Yang groaned and shook her head, knowing it may have sounded a little childish. Thankfully Winter didn't comment and raised her hands again for Yang to attack. "I don't suppose you found anything out that I should know." "I did, but those are not my stories to tell." "Figured as much," Yang replied, letting out a short breath as she struck out at the focus pad to increase her striking power. Clearly sensing that Yang wanted to speed things up a little, Winter started to move her hands around a little more, occasionally dodging the strikes and tapping her back to show where her defense was falling short. Before long, Yang began to feel a small bead of sweat build on her forehead and her mouth dry up from the exhaling. After a couple of minutes though, Winter's hand dodged the punch yet again and slammed into her chest, sending her stumbling backwards. "You forgot your footing," she said blandly, and shook her arm as she pulled off one of the gloves to stretch her fingers. "Take a break." Giving the woman a small nod, Yang pulled off her gloves and walked over to the bottle of water she had discarded earlier. Picking up her phone to check the time to discover that nearly 20 minutes had passed since Winter had arrived, she saw that she had the usual good morning message from Weiss, and quickly returned it as she squirted a large amount of room temperature liquid into her mouth. Turning back around, she saw Winter sat on the side of the ring rotating her shoulder. "You have some good power," the woman said, her pale blue eyes locking onto the bottle in Yang's hand and motioning for it. Taking the hint, she gently capped the bottle and tossed it over to her. "But you burn yourself out too quickly." "You told me not to hold back," Yang said, and walked towards the older woman. "I told you I wasn't frail," Winter countered after taking a long swig. "There is a difference between pulling your punches and measuring them." Yang knew Winter was right. It had always been a fault of hers that she tried to overpower the opponents early, but her current distracted state was only exacerbating that habit. So giving the woman a nod, she sat down on a bench opposite her and let herself breathe for a minute. After a couple of seconds though, Winter let out a deep sigh of her own and tossed the bottle back. "You are unlikely to find someone with more family problems than I, Yang," she said, her voice softening notably to a point where Yang actually looked up at her to see her eyes were a little less cold. "But you don't know me. So if you do not wish to talk, then I will not force you." "It's not that I don't want to." Yang sighed and looked back down at her knees with a small shake of her head as she decided to be honest. "If Weiss was free or Blake, the friend I mentioned earlier, was here, then I would in a heartbeat. Just not sure how I feel spilling my insecurities to someone who doesn't really like me that much." Moments passed in silence after her admission, and Yang didn't dare look up. Though Winter had been kind to her moments ago, Yang had technically just thrown it right back at her. However, the woman finally gave another more frustrated sigh and tapped her fist against the floor of the ring. "You and my sister are so alike that it is frustrating," the woman said with a slight sigh. "You both assume that just because I am cautious, that I do not like you, when in fact, I don't think Weiss could have introduced me to anyone more deserving." Taken aback by the words she had just heard and half convinced she had imagined them, Yang looked up to see Winter staring at her with a firm look in her eyes. "Yes, I would prefer she had chosen someone who was not former White Fan, but that is the only thing about you that makes me wary and will remain so for some time. And that is because of my past. Excluding that, however, you are quite a remarkable young woman. Not the best student, but you are kind and compassionate. Your willingness to face me and my father despite your fears, and the gift to Weiss on Christmas were more than enough to show me how much you care. So if I have ever given the impression that I do not like you, I apologize, because that is not the case." "Why you do like me?" Yang stuttered after almost a minute, wanting to make sure as the news still taking a while to sink in. "I do," she confirmed and stood up from her seat. "But my wariness remains." "Because of your scar?" Yang had no idea what made her ask the question, but it was the only thing she could think for why Winter was so nervous about the trusting she wasn't a threat. If she really did like her, then there had to be a personal reason why she was hanging on to her doubts so tightly. Fortunately, while Winter did stop, she didn't get angry or offended. Instead, she gave a slight nod of her head. "Yes," she said simply, and began to pull on the focus pads again. "It was my squad that responded to the burning of Litho's academy 3 years ago, and after successfully chasing away the terrorists, we began to extract everyone we could from the area. Little did we know that they had planted agents among the civilians. By the time we found out, a blade had already been dragged across my back. It was only because of my squad that I made it out of there. This scar reminds me that even the inconspicuous can be dangerous." After listening to the story, Yang let her head hang back down. She didn't know much about what had happened in Atlas with the White Fang, except that tensions there had always been much higher than everywhere else before they'd been expunged. But to burn down a school and plant assassins in the building was far worse than anything Yang could have imagined. Hearing that alongside know what Weiss went through, it was finally easy for Yang to see why Winter was so hesitant. "You shouldn't have had to go through that," was all she could say. "No, I shouldn't have," Winter agreed as she finally wiggled her hand back into the gloves. "But I did, and that can't be changed now." Smacking the pads together again, Winter pulled her shoulders back and let out a deep groan of relief. "So now that I have told you my past, and even admitted that I do not hate you. Perhaps you may feel more comfortable divulging your insecurities. Looking up at Winter as her voice had once again become much more gentle, Yang let out a small sigh and stood up to join her while slipping the gloves back on. Walking back to the woman and getting ready to start the exercise again, she questioned whether or not it was worth accepting the offer. After all, she was going to be attending the meeting no matter what, that had already been decided. But what if Winter thought her fears were childish, and caused her to reconsider her opinion on whether or not she was worthy to be with Weiss? On the other hand, however, Winter could help abate some of her fears. Weiss has always spoken highly of her sister for being there whenever she needed her, so would that courtesy be extended to her? A resigned groan left her as she raised her arms and struck out with a small, precise punch. What did she really have to lose? It wasn't like Weiss or Blake were available, and there was really anything that could make her more nervous, so taking another deep breath, she slowly exhaled and confessed her worries. "It's stupid," she breathed and struck the pad again, careful to keep her punches firm in measure. "But I guess I'm just worried that I won't get what I want out of meeting her." "And what is it that you want out of it?" "I dunno." Yang exhaled and landed a well-placed hook. "Answers. Why she left, why she never bothered to return, why she wants to see me now. Some other things too, I guess." "Well, it would be illogical to assume she doesn't think those will come up," Winter said matter-of-factly, and hopped out of the way of what Yang considered to be a perfect strike. "So since she is still following through means, it would be safe to assume that at least some answers will be gained." "I dunno, my dad says that she isn't exactly the most open person." "That is his experience, not yours." "How long has it been since he last saw her?" "Probably only a couple of times, since she left shortly after I was born." Yang breathed, now struggling to land a real hit on the focus pads as Winter began to move around in earnest. "But I doubt they were for very long." "Then he is unlikely to know the changes that may have happened in her life." The tone in Winter's voice was too sure of itself for Yang to ignore, and realizing she was beginning to wear herself out again chasing the woman, Yang slowed down and surveyed the white-haired soldier whose eyebrow was raised in intrigue. Winter had mentioned earlier that she knew things from looking into Raven's file, but had also made it clear she wouldn't say what they were. However, the confidence in her voice was enough to make Yang believe something big had happened to Raven. Was it recent? Or was it years ago? Was it the things that caused her to show up on my 13th, or her reason for showing up now? "I guess," Yang said noncommittally, feigning a jab with her left and sending out a real one with her right. "But what if that is still the case? Then you will have lost nothing." The reply was blunt enough that it caused Yang to slow down a little. "You will however have the peace of mind that you tried." It was Winter's turn to lower her arms and take a break this time. However, unlike Yang, the woman had barely broken a sweat. Taking it as a cue that the session was over, Yang also dropped her arms and let her body relax a little. "Family is different for everyone." Winter sighed and stretched her arm before taking off the focus pads. "While my relationship with Weiss and my mother is fine, I am in a similar situation with my brother as you are with your birth mother. Though admittedly the roles are reversed." "Yeah, Weiss mentioned that. He believes I do not care for him, that I have never cared for him," Winter said, and despite her clearly trying to keep her voice firm and informative, Yang could hear the very slight hint of sadness it held. "What he does not remember is me holding him when he would cry as a baby, all the times that I would put him to bed, when he fell asleep playing with his toys. He does not know that I would let him follow me and Weiss into the forest to encourage his curiosities, purposely digging in my heels into the snow to make it easier for him. Yet he does remember the times I ignored him and focused more on Weiss. His perception of me is influenced by only having half the facts." "And you're saying mine is too?" "Tell me, Yang." Winter replied quickly and walked over to the ring where her jacket was. "From the sounds of it, you have asked your father a lot about your birth mother, but in all your questions, have you ever asked about how she treated you before she left?" Despite knowing the answer, Yang didn't reply. She had indeed asked her father many questions, but they had all been in an attempt to find out why Raven left. Did they have a fight? Was she unhappy? Was there someone else? And to his credit, her father answered most of them, though not as many as she would like, but she had never asked anything like Winter had just asked her, and it was clear her sparring partner could tell that was the case. "It's human nature to ask only questions that will confirm our beliefs," Winter said while pulling the jacket back on. but to search for the answers that disprove them is how we grow and evolve. So I should ask him that? Yang asked as she watched the woman walk over to the discarded water bottle and squirt a little into her mouth. No, you should ask her that. Oh. Taking in Winter's words, Yang thought over every possible answer Raven could give. Had she really been distant like Yang always believed? Or had she been like Winter, loving in a way that had been unseen or forgotten? But if it was the latter, did that really change anything? She still left. If she had loved her and been more compassionate than Yang believed was the case, how could she have left her behind without looking back? Anyway, Winter's voice rang in her head, pulling her out of her thoughts. I must be going. I leave in 2 days, and there are still some things I must take care of before then. But think over what I said. I will. Yang nodded and pulled her gloves off to shake the offered hand. Thank you. It's actually rather nice talking with you when you're not trying to scare the shit out of me. Really? Winter replied with an amused smirk. Then it may distress you to know that had I been inclined, not a single one of your punches would have landed. Food for thought. While the statement was clearly Winter letting her know that she could easily take her in a fight, Yang couldn't help but grin at the playful tone it was said in. After a couple of seconds, however, their hands finally parted and Winter made her way towards the door, moving aside to let someone through it. Turning back as she reached it, she gave Yang a firm look that said she meant business. I believe the next time I'm in town that certain things here may be much more open, she said subtly as they were no longer alone. So you will have no choice but to join us for dinner. Understood. Yang agreed, knowing that Winter's choice or words regarding the request were precise. With that understanding taken care of, Winter left the room with little more than a wave of her hand, leaving Yang alone with the new arrival. Recognizing him, she gave him a small smile and moved back over to her punching bag until the man was done with him warm-ups and ready to spar. Pulling her gloves back on, she began to gently punch the bag, thanking God that her first actual conversation with Winter had been a good one, though still a little nervous regarding both dinners that were to happen in her future. Chapter 38. Saying Goodbye. Weiss Schnee. The silence that filled the back seat of the car was not a happy one, though it wasn't a completely sad one either. Sure, Weiss wished she didn't have to be accompanying Winter back to the military base where she wouldn't be able to see her again for what she knew would be too long. Unfortunately, though, she had also gone through it so many times in the past 4 years that she had grown a certain acceptance to it. However, that didn't mean she enjoyed the silence. It had been amazing having Winter back for the past few weeks. Normally her visits were only for a couple of days, sometimes a week at most, but to have her back for so long so that they could actually relax and simply enjoy catching up for once. So to have those weeks end with nothing more than a silent car ride would be incredibly unsatisfying to Weiss. Thankfully, it appeared Winter had the same idea as her voice sounded in her ear, the boredom evident in her voice. You're rather quiet, sister. She sighed and absent-mindedly pressed a button on the car, the heating turning on a little. Was my stay so long that you have run out of things to say to me? What? No, Weiss replied quickly, turning to look at her sister. I wish you didn't have to go. It's unfortunate that I do have to go, Winter replied and leaned back in her seat. Do you regret joining the military? Weiss asked cautiously. The question had been on her mind for a while, especially lately as she'd gradually seen a more free-spirited side of her sister than normal over the weeks. I regret leaving you all behind, Winter said sadly and turned to face her, her blue eyes full of genuine remorse that quickly turned to steely resolve. But if you mean do I wish to leave now, then no. The military has given me a purpose that I didn't have before. I thought you liked studying law? I did, but it was more something that would allow me to escape the business. The military started off as that too, but now I can't imagine not being in service. Even though it still hasn't given you the freedom you wanted from father? Weiss asked cautiously. You're still not able to do what you want. And you presume to know what that is, sister? While the tone of Winter's voice wasn't angry, there was a distinct chill there that made Weiss question whether continuing was a good idea. Was she really helping by bringing up old memories again? Was anything she said really going to make her sister stop putting her life on hold? She knew what Winter wanted, that much had been obvious whenever the topic had come up, but for all the things Winter had already fought, the woman still seemed scared to fight for the one thing she wanted most. You want to see Roman, she said slowly as Winter's eyes sharpened onto her own. I know you do. I want my sister to stop trying to use my past to talk me out of something she doesn't like so that I stick around longer. Winter scolded firmly, her posture stiffening. You may not see why, but I like being in the military, Weiss. It gives me a purpose, and my actions help people. But what about Roman? Roman and I are over. Winter replied without missing a beat, though Weiss suspected that had her voice not been so measured, there would have been far more pain present from those words. We have been separated for over 6 years. I have changed a lot, and I would not be surprised if he has too. Father is not the only reason I have not reached out to him. To throw away the life I am building by choice to chase the remnants of my teenage dream would be foolish. I'm sorry, Weiss replied and hung her head in shame. You're right. It wasn't right for me to do that. No, it wasn't, the older woman said sharply, though her voice was nowhere near as stern as it had been seconds ago. Thankfully, the elder Schnee let out a sigh and rested a hand on her shoulder. But I know you are just worried about me, so let us not have our final conversation of my visit be an argument. Looking up from her lap, she saw that the softness had returned to her sister's eyes. Giving a brief nod, she received a small smile, and the hand was removed from her shoulder. Good. Winter breathed and sat back in her seat, her body turned slightly to face her direction. So what are your plans after you see me off? Work, Weiss replied dully, slumping in her own seat a little at the prospect. Ever since Christmas, that was all her life had been. Just like when she'd been reassigned to the Research and Development Department, Weiss had spent the last couple of days poring over everything she missed during her reappointment. In addition to that, she had decided to go back further and review things she previously gave to real attention to. With all of that work and trying to make headway with her newest project of interest, Auburn Fletch and his patent, it was incredibly difficult for her to find time to do anything else. The worst thing about it, however, was that her contact with Yang had become rather limited due to all the work. If there was ever a time where Weiss wanted to be there for her girlfriend, it was when the blonde brawler's first official meeting with the woman who abandoned her was just around the corner. Weiss really wanted to be there for her, not just over the scroll, but actually be there. But with adjusting to everything in her new position, she really needed to work hard to ensure her place in the company. Sound rather dull, but then again, I never really did like finance side of business, Winter said with a raised brow while eyeing her carefully. You know you can take a break to pay a certain blonde a visit, right? I would love to, Weiss groaned, doubting that any words she'd ever spoken were truer. But I need to get ahead on this before college starts and everything happens with Father. And you will, Winter said with certainty. But those are the reasons to take a break and see her, so that you do not forget why you are pushing yourself. Besides, I believe she could use your company at least once before the coming day. Feeling her eyes widen at the woman's words, Weiss looked directly at her sister with concern. Though she had talked to her a couple of times regarding her worries, she had not mentioned anything specific as it was Yang's business. But the way Winter spoke showed knowledge that she shouldn't have gleaned from those moments. What do I? A firm stare cut her off and gave her the answer to the unfinished question. You went to see her? I did, she replied without remorse, though her eyes were still watching her with intrigue. You expressed your worry, so I thought I would attempt to abate it a little since you were unable to. And how did it go? Weiss asked cautiously, knowing that some kind of warning was likely given back at the townhouse despite Yang's assurance that nothing of the sort had happened. If you are asking whether I was overprotective big sister, then no. Winter smirked mischievously before letting his face fall to a more solemn one, not helping her worries a single bit. But she is clearly a little worried, something that a visit from you may help lessen. But the BU. Weiss tried to argue weakly, though she had no idea why. Can wait. Winter interrupted her again, this time her voice firm enough to cause a shiver to run up her back. Trust me, sister, not being there at such an important moment will be something you regret. Feeling a hand on her knee, Weiss let out a deep sigh. She knew Winter was right, and she had even done what Winter was suggesting in the past, but Weiss couldn't do that much this time. While it was tempting to throw caution to the wind again and continue her work at the much warmer house, and in the warm arms of her girlfriend, she was due in the office at 7 in the morning, so it wasn't really feasible to do so. There was also plenty of work to be done before then, so even if she did go, it could only be for 30 minutes tops. And there was a big issue with that which was only getting worse. I don't like the short visits, Weiss admitted while shaking her head, feeling the car begin to slow and eventually stop. Every time I see her, I just want to stay with her. I still hate having to leave and keep us hidden from everyone. And I know that if I visit her today with what is happening tomorrow, she will want me to stay, and I know I can't. I remember that feeling. Winter sighed fondly, placing her hand on the door handle to push it open. And that time will come, but she needs you right now. So be there for her, like you know she would be for you. Weiss knew Winter was right. If it was her in need, Yang would rush to her side no matter what, barring anything serious with her family. So for her to not be doing the same made her feel like she was doing something wrong. Remembering that, she realized that there was no longer a choice in what she had to do, and stepped out of the car to join her sister. Cold winds instantly greeted her, though thankfully the weather had improved a little over the last couple of days, and stopped next to Winter, as Hazel removed her luggage from the trunk of the car. From the military base that sat a small distance up the road from them, Weiss would already see two tall men walking towards them in what seemed like more rigorous form than even the military would enforce. Clearly Winter saw them too, as she let out a very clear groan of disgust. "Why is she here?" she said, more to herself than to Weiss. Confused by the words as she didn't see a woman with the two men, Weiss took a step back as they marched up to the car, and spoke at what she instantly recognized as an Atlesian accent, albeit far more pompous than was believable. "Specialist Schnee," one man said, his eyes barely visible beneath his hat. "Miss Schnee," the other said with his own hat in the same position, his voice so similar to the man beside him that Weiss guessed they had to be twins. "Tweedle, Tweedle. May I ask why you two are here in Vale, and not protecting the Argus relay base?" The weird inflection Winter put on the word protecting was something that definitely caught Weiss' attention. It was halfway between derision and aggrandizing, however the two men apparently didn't seem to notice anything and continued like normal. "Special Operative Cordovan requested we bring you to her the moment you arrive. Please," both men chorused together. "Follow us." Unfazed by the men, Winter simply raised an eyebrow and placed her hands behind her back. Straightening her back, her face turned to stone, and she gave them a withering glance. "I will follow you shortly," she said in a voice that would make their father second-guess his actions. "Now why don't you two march back to the gate, and I will go with you after I say goodbye to my sister." There was no mistaking the inflection this time. It was a warning, plain and simple enough that even the two Tweedles in front of her clearly heard it too. "Very well," they both said, with a small bow before turning on their heels and marching their way back to the gate. "Idiots," she groaned again to herself. "I really wish General Ironwood could just let that woman and her ridiculous guards go. More trouble than she is worth." "Why can't he?" Weiss asked, curious as to why Winter would badmouth someone of higher rank than herself. "Confidential," Winter sighed, though she did give Hazel a smile as she accepted the luggage. "Anyway, I'm afraid it is time for me to go." "I know," she replied sadly, and turned to her sister, as she felt a pair of arms wrap around her. "I really wish you could stay though." "I'm sorry, Weiss," the older woman replied and pulled away, too soon for Weiss' liking. "But hopefully it won't be as long until my next visit. I do have another sibling that I need to start repairing my relationship with." "That might be tough," Weiss said, knowing Winter would appreciate the honesty on the matter. "I'm aware," she said with a nod, and leaned down to pick up her duffel bag. "But it is about time I started to make amends there. I at least hope he remembers that I said goodbye this time." "I'm sure he will," Weiss hummed, knowing exactly how good their brother's memory was. "I will take your word." Winter smiled, and gave her one last quick hug. "But I really must go or Caroline will give me a headache for being late, though I suspect that will be the case regardless." Even through her sadness, Weiss couldn't help but smile at Winter complaining about a higher-up. Unfortunately, the smile quickly faded as her sister Tua stepped towards the gate and turned around. "It was good to see you again, Winter," she said sadly, and resisted the urge to run over and hug the woman again to stop her from leaving. "Likewise," the woman replied and slung the bat over her shoulder and took a step backwards. "Until next time, sister. Goodbye." Giving Winter a small wave before the woman turned and walked towards the gate of the base, Weiss watched her older sister walk through and disappear from sight. The feeling of loss immediately washed over her, and it was with no small amount of sadness that she returned to her seat in the car. Feeling the tears start to fall down her cheek, she quickly wiped them away and let herself shrink into the soft leather, "Where to, Mishnee?" Hazel said, as he got into the front seat, his voice notably softer than usual. Having been asked the question in her current saddened state, there was only one real answer than she wanted, an answer that would at the very least make both her and Yang happy for a little while. So wiping away another tears that fell down her cheek, she coughed to clear her throat. "To her, please, Hazel." Chapter 39. An Old Friend Returns. Yang Xiaolong. "Still looking at that Bella booty, huh?" Wrapping her arm around Ilya's shoulder, as the girl's freckles turned a blazing red, Yang chuckled and looked over to where the small chameleon fawness kept glancing out of the corner of her eye. Though they were the same age, Ilya had always been rather short. In fact, the girl was almost as short as Weiss. The girl had also always been infatuated with Blake, more so than Yang was back in the day. Blake was aware of it, of course, just like she apparently was about Yang's crush, though the attempted kiss by Ilya years ago was a bigger giveaway, but had never done anything to turn Ilya away or tease her. That didn't mean Ilya didn't steal the same glances Yang once did. And though Yang was very happy with Weiss, even she had to admit that Blake bent over the table talking to Sun was still a sight to beholding. "And I see you haven't changed one bit." "Excuse me." Yang laughed, unable to even pretend to be insulted. "I have changed a lot. I no longer even look at the Bella booty." "Idiot." Ilya scoffed and knocked her arm away as she busied herself with cleaning a table in an attempt to hide her continually reddening freckles. "I'm messing with you." Yang chuckled, sitting down in one of the chairs and shrugging her jacket off. "It's good to see you again, though. How's Menagerie and your grandma?" "Gran is doing better now that her leg is healed," Ilya replied while stacking cups together. "I miss the heat of Menagerie already, though. Not to mention you were on the beach every day." Yang sighed longingly, wishing for a beach visit in her near future. Maybe with Weiss. "I'm jealous already. Sun, sand, bikinis." "Since when have you ever needed a beach to wear a bikini?" Ilya interrupted with a smirk. "Excuses to show off this body are always nice," Yang countered with a shrug, causing the smaller girl to shake her head. "Told you that you haven't changed." Ilya chuckled and slung the cloth over her shoulder. Standing up and helping Ilya by picking up the large tray of empty cups, Yang followed her friend into the back room, where she placed the tray on the side to wash when she officially started her shift. Turning around, she saw Ilya dragging a large pack of coffee from the bottom drawer. "So how you finding being back in Vale so far?" she asked with a smile, hooking her foot around her chair and dragging it out to sit back down. "You feeling at home? Or are you an island girl now?" "It's louder than I remember." Ilya laughed as she picked up the bag, her strength surprising considering the girl's size. "But I'm looking forward to catching up with the groups again." "I bet the ones in Menagerie are much different," Yang replied, shifting a little as she blocked out what Ilya continuing her group work meant. "Not really." Ilya shrugged, letting out a sigh as she shifted the heavy bag to her shoulder. "Only real difference is that the people there had to move away to escape it." "I guess that's true," Yang said mumbled. "Anyway, I'm gonna get these to Blake and then head upstairs for my break since I'm still kinda jet-lagged." The girl groaned and made her way towards the door. "We'll catch up properly when I get back." "No problem, Rainbow." She grinned as Ilya left the room. However, once the girl left the room, Yang's smile dropped and she let out a loud sigh. It wasn't that she didn't like Ilya. In fact, the girl was one of her closest friends and she loved her like a sister. But her being in Menagerie helping her grandmother recover had certainly helped avoid certain situations. With her return, though, future things would become a little more difficult, and there was a conversation she would certainly need to have the next time she saw her girlfriend. Though that wasn't the only conversation in her near future, and was much less of a concern than the other. In less than 24 hours, she was due to meet Raven. The mere thought made Yang shiver. In less than 24 hours she would be face to face with the woman who gave birth to her, the woman that had stolen her away from her father only to later return and leave her on the doorstep. A woman who had returned only once since that day and barely said a word to her. I am being an idiot for giving her another chance? Yang asked herself, not for the first time that day, nor even that week. Letting out a deep groan as she stood up and began to fill the sink, she gripped the side and bent over. She was tired of feeling like she did. Scared, like she would find out the woman had only arrived to tell her she wasn't worth it. If she even showed up. Despite the talk with Winter days earlier, The thoughts had been growing increasingly persistent, invading her mind during every free moment she had. For every reasonable counter she tried to give the thoughts, her demons always had the perfect retort. Why would she take me with her if she hadn't cared? She brought you back. Maybe she had too? You were her daughter. I was a baby. What could I have done wrong? Some people are just born unlovable. Why am I tormenting myself with this? Because you were too weak to accept, she just didn't want you. Every question she asked to calm her mind was turned on her, and she hated it. She hated herself for it being her mind that gave the answers. Her doubts. Her fears. Hers. Hearing the thin metal sink groan under her tightening fingers, Yang felt her breath shudder and let go. She was done crying. Too many nights had ended in doubtful tears lately. She hated crying in general, having felt she should have outgrown such actions long ago. So with a begrudging sniffle, she pulled her phone from her pocket and put on her playlist to listen to, hoping that the loud strums of guitars and beating of drums that immediately flooded her mind as she put in her headphones would be enough to keep her mind clear in the lonely back room. Blake had offered her the day off, of course, but she turned it down as she wanted to stay busy. Thankfully, though, the breakfast rush had just ended, so there were likely to be very few food orders, which meant Blake would actually come into the back and tell her if anything was needed instead of tapping on the door. So with one final sigh, she turned off the tap and went about her business sorting out her area. Letting herself get lost in her music, Yang slowly went about her usual start of shift routine. After washing up the cups and trays she had brought in earlier, she moved over to rearranging everything in the fridge to how she liked it. While Blake and Gary usually understood that Yang liked her workspace a certain way, Callie often had a tendency to move things around. Yang recognized it, of course, the clear sign of someone who tended to be the housekeeper keeping their things straight, but with Ilya back at the shop, the fridge was a mess. After 30 minutes of pulling everything out and returning it to the proper spot, Yang was back sitting on her stool with her head in her arms. Though the small amount of distraction had been nice, she had made quick work of it and wished she'd taken a little longer, as since she had finished with the task her mind had once again began worrying. And just like always, the effect of the loud music was fading, and she was struggling to push the thoughts away. However, as she once again began to ask herself the same questions, she felt something move on either side of her waist and a warm body press against her back. While Yang tensed for a brief second, silky white hair that appeared in the corner of her eye immediately put her at ease, a sense of relief rushing through her as the pair of headphones were gently tugged from her ears by the cord. "I missed you," said the comfortingly familiar voice of her girlfriend, though Yang picked up a little strain in it. "I missed you too," Yang replied gently, though what would have caused Weiss' voice to be a little rough. "Did you see Winter off?" A slight nod of the woman's head was the reply as Weiss' arms wrapped a little tighter around Yang's waist. Reaching down, Yang took one of Weiss' hands in her own and leaned her head back a little, her ponytail pushing against the sullen heir's shoulder. "I hate seeing her go." "I know." A blissful silence fell upon them, and unlike the lonely silence before, Yang found her mind free of doubts. Weiss was there. The woman she loved, the woman who loved her. The walking contradiction of every doubt her brain had been throwing at her over the past few days had her arms wrapped around her waist. After a minute or two, though, a small breath escaped the woman. "I can't stay long," she said quietly, and despite knowing that was likely the case, Yang felt a little sad nonetheless. "How are you doing?" "Coping," Yang replied softly and fiddled with Weiss' fingers. "Sort of." "Hey." Yang felt the arms around her loosen, and while the urge to grab then and not let Weiss leave arose, it quickly died down as Weiss slipped between her and the desk to sit on her lap, an arm raising up to slide behind Yang's neck and slowly play with her hair. "What's on your mind?" "I just..." Swallowing the lump in her throat, Yang gazed into the shining blue eyes of her girlfriend and found a source of courage that helped her continue. "I hate that I need to know that I can't just be strong enough to ignore this. I hate that I can't shake this feeling of being unlovable when I know plenty of people do love me. Meeting Raven tomorrow is just making them worse, and I can't get rid of the thoughts." The hum was gentle and understanding. "I'm sorry, consoling is more your thing, so I don't know how to stop those thoughts. But I can say you are absolutely loved. Me, Ruby, Blake, Ty. Summer. You have a family who loves you more than you could ever know. Just keep remembering that, okay? And if you ever need reminding, you call me immediately. Weiss was right. She wasn't the best at consoling people. Everything she'd said were things Yang had been trying to tell herself the whole week. But for some reason, it helped a little. Whether it was someone else confirming it or the fact it was Weiss, Yang didn't know, but she felt a faint smile pull at her lips. To show how much it meant to her, she leaned in to press her lips against Weiss, and as met by what she knew had to be the softest, most caring kiss they had shared. There was no heat that went rushing through her, no exhilaration or desire, simply reassurance. It was that feeling that also made it the hardest to pull away from, reassurance being exactly what she craved above all things at that moment. But unfortunately, as much as she would love to spend the afternoon kissing Weiss under normal circumstances, the woman's presence was more than enough for her. Thank you, Yang breathed as their lips finally parted. For being here for my mini freakout. Again. You are the woman I love, Weiss replied simply, resting her forehead against hers. You never have to thank me. I know I can't always rush to your side like you can for me, or stay the night, and believe me when I say there is nothing more that I want than to do that tonight, but I will always be here for you if you need to talk. Weiss' freehand motioned to Yang's scroll that still rested on her lap between them. Getting the hint, Yang gave her an understanding nod and captured the pointing hand with her own. Another silence settled over them, just as blissful as the last, and Yang spent the time peacefully running her thumb over the back of the pale woman's hand. There was always something peaceful about the silences with Weiss, the same thing that she loved about the young Schnee in general. She never had to be energetic or excitable as Weiss enjoyed silences, so every now and then Yang was able to simply let go and let the peaceful atmosphere envelop her. So how is it saying goodbye to winter? She asked after a couple of minutes, keeping her voice low as she knew winter leaving was something just as painful for Weiss. It sucked, Weiss sighed, her head falling to rest on the shoulder of the arm slung around Yang's neck. I just wish she could stay. She probably does too, Yang replied, receiving a small look from her girlfriend. Call it a sister's intuition. MHM, Weiss hummed, her head dropping again as she nuzzled in a little closer. Don't suppose you picked up that intuition from her visit the other day? She told you about that, huh? Yang breathed and wrapping her free arm around Weiss, who gave a nod in reply. A little, I guess. Didn't really need that to know how much she cares for you, though. I know, still just sucks to see her go. Despite the sadness in Weiss' words, a small smile stretched across her face as her head turned upwards a little to look her in the eye. But at least I have your Christmas gift. A small smile tugged at her own lips as she stared down at her girlfriend. Yeah, well, she replied, unable to keep the pride from her voice. I'm glad you like it. Especially since you have no idea what I did to get it. I read that in your note. Weiss chuckled, the melodic song doing wonders for Yang's spirit. Do I dare to ask what that was? I'll spare you the nightmares, Yang said facetiously, as the actual drawing Blake had her do wasn't as bad as she'd feared. If she hadn't let me have it though, no idea what I would have done. A text would have been enough. But I do that every morning. And waking up to a text from you is the highlight of my morning, Weiss countered, the honesty evident in her voice as the girl stuck her tongue out. Yang wasn't dumb. She knew Weiss was trying to get her mind off of Raven, and though it was working for the most part, the meeting with the woman was still there. However, even if it was only a little, it was still working, so letting a wider smile take over her face, she leaned down and lightly kissed her girlfriend. The minutes passed with pleasant conversation and scattered kisses, each minute soothing Yang's mind more and more. Weiss told her of the work she was doing now that she had returned to her old department, and while in truth Yang found most of it boring, Weiss seemed to be proud of what she was doing, so Yang was easily able to find some interest. Blake popped her head in at some point to relay a food order, so Weiss had reluctantly removed herself from what had been a rather comfortable position for the two. Yang had tried to hold on to her a little longer, but the lithe woman had easily wiggled out of her grasp with a joyous laugh. Placing the lid back on the butter and putting it back into the fridge, Yang turned around to see Weiss leaning against the far counter, her eyes watching her every move with intrigue. Squinting with a slight smile, she shut the fridge and cocked her head to silently ask what was so interesting. The answer she received, however, was much more simple than she expected. I love watching you work, she said quietly, like her words could break the moment if said too loud. It's not exactly the most glamorous thing. Yang chuckled back and wiped down her counter. I don't care. Weiss replied with a smile of her own. You seem more calm. Before Weiss could finish her sentence, the door to the stairway opened. And much to her dismay, Ilya stood in the archway. Weiss fell silent immediately in the presence of the unknown person, and Yang felt herself tense, for good reason. Though Ilya seemed to be unaware she had been walking in on anything at first, she clearly recognized that there were more people in the room than she expected. Her eyes flicked immediately to Weiss, and Yang held her breath, hoping to gods that had never aided her before that Ilya wouldn't recognize her. For a few seconds, Yang thought that maybe they were on her side for once, but then exactly what she expected happened. It was gradual at first, but as Ilya's eyes flickered between the faint smile on Weiss' face and what Yang knew was her own obviously nervous expression, the telltale signs quickly sped up. In seconds, Ilya's eyes, freckles, and hair had changed to a pale yellow, and a quivering sneer pulled at her face. While Yang wasn't afraid Ilya would do anything, she still found it important to pull herself together and take a step forward. Ilya, she... Bang! The sound of the door Ilya had came through echoed around the kitchen as it was slammed shut, quickly followed by the loud stamping of feet up the stairs. Closing her eyes and letting out a deep breath, Yang swore inwardly and turned back to Weiss. Opening her eyes, she saw that the heiress' smile was completely gone, replaced with a look of confusion. Knowing she would have to answer, she shook her head and sat down on her chair. Sorry about that. Okay, Weiss replied, her voice making it even more obvious that she had no idea what had just happened. And that was? That? Yang sighed and motioned toward the door. Was Ilya. A friend of mine. I know she is a friend of yours, Weiss replied, straightening herself to show she had recognized the difference in atmosphere. There is a picture of you, her, and Blake on your bedroom wall. I was more curious about that reaction. I know Shnees are not loved by the faunus, but that is more anger than I have experienced in some time. Ilya is complicated, Yang replied honestly, leaning forward on her arm. When she was young, her parents died. I'm still confused. What does that have to do? They died in a Shnee mine, Yang interrupted quickly, daring only to look up once. Though once was enough to see Weiss' face fall. They were from Mantle. One day the mine shaft they were working in collapsed, and they didn't make it out. She moved to Vale to live with her grandma after that. Weiss was silent for a couple of minutes, but eventually Yang saw the woman's arms fold, and an aura of power exuded from her. Clearly Weiss could tell there was something more. What else? Weiss asked firmly, no anger in her voice, but unwavering nonetheless. Yang didn't reply straight away, nervous as to how Weiss would take the news, but Weiss quickly put an end to that. Yang! We promise no more hiding things. Letting out a deep sigh and leaning back to face her, Yang looked into her girlfriend's eyes. She was in the white fan with me and Blake. And she didn't exactly, completely leave. Weiss' eyebrow raised the moment the final words had left Yang's mouth, and wanting to explain the situation fully, she rose from her chair and took a step towards the small woman, who somehow seemed 100 feet tall. But I swear, it's nothing like that. She left that part behind with us, but stayed to help people. Help people? Yes, Yang replied quickly to what she thought was a disbelieving tone. She helps run support groups to give back for everyone she went to growing up. They don't promote violence or anything, they're just places for people who are feeling distressed can go and talk. They even set up interviews and stuff for those struggling to find jobs. Do you not see how this complicates things? I do, replied quickly and reached for Weiss' hand, thankful that it wasn't pulled away. Trust me, I do. Affiliation with the White Fan makes things harder for us to come out to your father, but she is as far from that part of it as you can be without leaving. She isn't exactly fond of your family, but I promise she is a good person. Just like me and Blake. Weiss' eyes bored into hers, and for the first time that day, Yang was unable to make out what she was thinking. While there wasn't anger there, doubt was definitely present. To show she was being honest, Yang maintained her eye contact for as long as would be needed. Finally, though, Weiss moved her eyes away and let out a sigh of her own. Today is not the day for this discussion, she said firmly with a shake of her head. Are you mad at me? No, Weiss replied quickly, the thin fingers clasping her tighter. But I wish you hadn't kept this from me. You being a former member is complicated enough, but being friends with someone who still calls themselves a member makes things tougher. I need to think on how to deal with this. Oh, okay. Hearing Weiss let out a sigh, she felt the snowy-haired girl's hand press against her cheek and instinctively leaned into it. Glancing back into the pale blue eyes, she saw they had dropped their ice and regained some of their heat. I just said I'm not mad, she said comfortingly. Your meeting with Raven is tomorrow, and you need to relax before it. I need to think about how we'll handle this when the media finds out. And then we'll discuss this, okay? Okay. Good, Weiss whispered quietly and pulled her down to place a short-lived kiss on her lips. But I do have to go now. I have work. You leaving after this feel wrong, Yang voiced, knowing Weiss likely shared her thoughts. Your visit was almost perfect. It still was. I got to see you again, after all. Biting her lips, Weiss' fingers fiddled with a lock of her hair as thoughts clearly rushing through her mind. After a couple of seconds, though, the fog of ill faded and Weiss gave her a decisive stare. But to make up for this part, I will do my best to make sure that the next time you see me, you will see me till morning. Taken aback by what Yang knew was a promise, she gave a very quick nod in response and pressed her lips against her girlfriend's. Deal? Good. I love you. Nothing is going to change that. I love you too. After one last kiss, they pulled away from each other, and Weiss made her way to the door. With a small wave and a promise to call later, she left and Yang was once again alone. While it was not the full conversation and had happened much sooner than she liked, telling her about Ilya had gone much smoother than she would have put money on. Though that was unfortunately only for Weiss. She couldn't tell Ilya the truth about her relationship with Weiss, but she would have to at the very least explain their friendship. Given Ilya's past, Yang knew that was going to be difficult, but the girl wasn't unreasonable. Stubborn, but still able to see sense. So letting out a groan knowing she should get it done as soon as possible, she placed her towel on the counter and made her way to the front of the store to inform Blake of her impromptu break.
And that's all for today. Thanks for coming by and hanging out. I hope to see you next time.